Money doesn't just open doors in this city, it owns them. For over 3 decades, Nathaniel Hawthorne turned justice into a marketplace where innocence was worthless and guilt was just a number on a check. His signature adorned every corrupt deal, his influence tainted every institution, and his name became a whispered warning in the halls of power. They said crossing him was like crossing fate itself, inevitable destruction, wrapped in designer suits and offshore accounts. But fate had never encountered Judge Jonathan Pierce. They called him the last honest man in a broken system, a judge who couldn't be threatened, bribed, or broken. The son of Chicago's unforgiving streets, Jonathan rose to become corruption's worst nightmare. In 30 years on the bench, he had never compromised, never looked away, and never forgotten what justice costs when you refuse to sell it. As Judge Pierce's gavel cut through the manufactured silence of courtroom 12B, two immovable forces were about to collide. Hawthorne believed his money could drown any truth. Pierce knew some truths can't be drowned. They can only be delayed. And justice had waited long enough. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of courtroom 12B, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. Judge Jonathan Pierce stood before the mirror in his chambers, adjusting his black robes with practiced precision. His dark fingers smoothed down the fabric as his mind wandered to the challenging day ahead. After 20 years on the bench, he'd earned his reputation for unwavering integrity, but cases like today's always tested the limits of justice. "Your Honor," his clerk, Grace Holloway, knocked softly. "They're ready for you." Jonathan nodded, taking one final look in the mirror. The face that gazed back at him bore the weathered determination of a man who'd fought his way up from nothing. Growing up in Southside Chicago, he'd watched his mother work 3 jobs to put him through law school. Every sacrifice, every obstacle overcome, had led to this moment. "Another day in pursuit of justice," he murmured, following Grace into the corridor. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Today's case had drawn national attention. Nathaniel Hawthorne, CEO of Hawthorne Global, faced charges of tax fraud, embezzlement, and offshore money laundering. The scale of his alleged crimes was staggering. Millions siphoned from pension funds and community development projects. Assistant District Attorney Isabel Vega sat at the prosecution table, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. She'd spent months building this case, knowing the deck was stacked against her. Hawthorne's crimes had devastated vulnerable communities, leaving retired teachers and factory workers struggling to make ends meet while he lived in luxury. The defense table sat conspicuously empty. Judge Pierce checked his watch. 9:15. Hawthorne was already 15 minutes late. At 9:27, the courtroom doors burst open. Nathaniel Hawthorne strolled in, phone pressed to his ear, his designer suit perfectly tailored to his tall frame. His silver hair gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his tanned face bore the smug expression of a man accustomed to buying his way out of trouble. "Buy the shares now," he spoke into his phone, ignoring the bailiff's disapproving look. "I don't care about the market predictions. Just do it." "All rise for the Honorable Judge Jonathan Pierce," the bailiff announced. The entire courtroom stood, except Hawthorne, who continued his phone conversation while lounging in his chair. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Even Hawthorne's attorney, Evelyn Cross, looked uncomfortable, tugging at her client's sleeve. Judge Pierce's face remained impassive as he took his seat. His voice, when it came, carried the quiet authority of a man who'd faced far worse than entitled billionaires. "Mr. Hawthorne," he said, his tone measured. "In this courtroom, we observe certain protocols. One of those is standing when the judge enters. Another is refraining from phone calls during proceedings." Hawthorne finally ended his call, but remained seated, fixing Pierce with a look of thinly veiled disdain. "My apologies, Your Honor," he drawled, making the title sound like an insult. "I was handling some rather important business matters." "More important than showing respect for this court?" Hawthorne smirked. "That depends on one's perspective, doesn't it?" The gallery fell silent. Judge Pierce leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes holding Hawthorne's gaze. "Let me adjust your perspective, Mr. Hawthorne. You're facing federal charges that could put you away for 30 years. Your business matters can wait. Stand up." For a long moment, Hawthorne didn't move. The tension in the courtroom grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, with deliberate slowness, he rose to his feet. "Thank you," Pierce said. "You may be seated. Now, let's proceed with the arraignment." As Isabel Vega began presenting the charges, a court officer quietly approached the bench, slipping Judge Pierce a folded note. He read it discreetly. "Watch your back. Hawthorne owns half the police department. Evidence has a way of disappearing in his cases." Pierce's expression didn't change as he tucked the note into his robes. He'd suspected as much. Detective Leonard Hayes, the police chief handling evidence in this case, had a reputation for being susceptible to persuasion. But suspicions weren't proof, and Pierce knew he'd need to proceed carefully. The morning proceeded with a series of legal motions. Evelyn Cross, streamlined in an expensive charcoal suit, argued skillfully for dismissal based on procedural grounds. Vega countered with passionate precision, laying out the devastating impact of Hawthorne's schemes on local communities. During a brief recess, Judge Pierce watched through his chamber windows as reporters swarmed Hawthorne on the courthouse steps. The businessman played to the cameras with practiced ease. "This is a witch hunt," Hawthorne declared, flashing his perfect white teeth. "Judge Pierce clearly has an agenda. I've faced tougher judges than him, and I'm still here. The truth will prevail." Several news channels were already running segments debating judicial bias. Some pundits praised Pierce's restraint in handling Hawthorne's disrespect, while others questioned whether a judge from his background could be truly impartial in a case involving a wealthy white defendant. Back in chambers, Isabel Vega knocked on Pierce's door, her face drawn with worry. "Your Honor, do you have a moment?" He gestured for her to enter. "What's troubling you, counselor?" "Our key witness, the whistleblower from Hawthorne's accounting department. They're getting cold feet. Someone's been following them, taking photos of their kids at school. The police say there's nothing they can do." Pierce's jaw tightened. "Of course they do." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "MS. Vega, this case will test everything we believe about justice. Hawthorne doesn't just break laws. He thinks they don't apply to him. People like that are dangerous precisely because they believe their money puts them above the system." "How do we fight that?" Isabel asked, frustration evident in her voice. "One step at a time," Pierce replied. "Build your case methodically. Document everything. Trust no one outside your immediate team. And remember, men like Hawthorne often plant the seeds of their own destruction through their arrogance." As Isabel left, Pierce found himself reflecting on his own journey to the bench. He remembered his first case as a public defender, representing a young black man falsely accused of robbery. The evidence proving his innocence had mysteriously vanished from the police station. That case had taught him hard lessons about justice and power, lessons that would serve him well now. The afternoon session brought more of Hawthorne's subtle defiance. He answered questions with barely concealed contempt, his responses dripping with condescension. Yet Pierce noticed something beneath the arrogant exterior. Flickers of unease when certain documents were mentioned, slight tensions in his jaw when specific dates came up. At day's end, Hawthorne sauntered out of the courtroom, pausing at the door. "Don't worry too much about this case, Judge," he called back. "I'm sure we can come to an understanding." The implied threat hung in the air. As Pierce gathered his papers, he thought of the note in his robe, of Isabel's worried face, of all the lives ruined by Hawthorne's greed. The path ahead would be treacherous. But Jonathan Pierce had spent his life preparing for cases like this. Later that night, in his modest home study, Pierce reviewed the day's transcripts. His wife, Angela, brought him a cup of tea, her presence a quiet comfort. "Tough case?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Pierce sighed. "Hawthorne thinks he's above the law. He's used to buying his way out of trouble, manipulating the system. The way he looked at me today, like I was beneath him, like my position meant nothing." Angela squeezed his shoulder. "Then show him what real justice looks like." Pierce covered her hand with his, drawing strength from her support. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, he allowed himself to remember why he'd become a judge in the first place. Not for power or prestige, but to ensure that justice truly was blind. Blind to wealth, to influence, and yes, to race. As night deepened outside his window, Judge Jonathan Pierce continued working, preparing for the battles ahead. In his mind, he could already see the forces aligning against him. Hawthorne's money, corrupt police, manipulated media. But he'd faced impossible odds before and prevailed. This case would be his biggest test yet. But Jonathan Pierce had never been one to back down from a fight.